All right, hello everybody. I am here today with a very special guest. His name is KRIS Hager, also known as Data Driven Investing. You can find him in the description on Twitter. Also has an amazing Substack that Chamath Palihapitiya apparently reads, which is really interesting. So let's get started at that. We're waiting for KRIS and VITALY to get here. They're running a little bit late. How did you feel, KRIS, when Chamath responded to your post around you not having enough impressions to monetize on Twitter, but said that your Substack is amazing? It seems like he
I,
reads your SoFi content.
at least he's read some of it, like, which was pretty incredible, right? Like, I don't know, I felt super humbled, right? It was one of those, definitely got some imposter syndrome on there. Um, just, I don't know, like, kind of took me aback. Like because I went back and forth with Peter Thiel a few weeks ago about Open Door, and then I know
Wait, are
Noto's
you
like
Peter
retweeted
Thiel
my
or Keith
stuff.
Raboy?
Keith Raboy, sorry, not Peter
Okay.
Thiel.
I
You're
was
right,
like, you
Keith
got to talk
Raboy.
to
No,
Peter
no, no,
Thiel?
not
What?
not Peter Thiel. Right, but and that was public, like just kind of chatting back and forth. But when Chamath got on there, like knowing that like a billionaire read my stuff was like kind of weird. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I think he read it because you talk about SoFi, and obviously he was part of taking SoFi public. So it seems like if
Yeah,
I think Chamath internally feels bad that there's a lot of bag holders on SoFi. Now, did he know the whole market was going to collapse? No. So is it actually his fault to know? But he probably is just like all of us that wants to. I think he still has 85% of his SoFi position that wants analysis on it. And you are the guy when it comes to SoFi analysis. So it seems like he probably just typed it in Google and found you. And now he reads your shit.
I know. It was anyway. It was crazy. Yeah, I assume like Chamath, I mean, there's lots of people who say lots of things about him, but I think he's really authentic to himself, right? Like he doesn't really BS. He doesn't, like he pumps his stuff in that like he supports the things that he's invested in. That doesn't seem that dishonest to me, right? But like and yeah, a bunch of the reverse specs that he did went public right at the top and stuff. But like you can't really blame him for that. Anyway, so I think he is an authentic person in general. Maybe I'm very wrong, but but yeah, and like you said, he owns like 80% of his original position still in SoFi, so I'm sure he does carry a little bit of a weight
Yeah.
from
For those that are
doing
tuning
that.
in, KRIS and VITALY are just running a little late, so they're going to be here in a second. But we have KRIS, Data Driven Investing, on with us today. So I want to talk about SoFi a bit, and then we'll get into Enphase and some energy stuff. SoFi is at
Yeah.
$8. It has given away all of its earnings gains since July 31st, when it hit a peak of around $11.70. What are your thoughts? I know you're not a big stock guy; you're more a fundamentals guy, but the company has given up 30% of their value. How are you feeling currently about SoFi, and any bull or bear flags coming at you in terms of where it's at in its life cycle right now?
I think so. It's at an interesting place because I mean the results were stellar, right? Like fundamentally speaking, you couldn't have asked for anything better. I guess you could have asked for a little bit better profitability, but the fact that they grew so much in the quarter didn't. It mean like I'm not worried about it, right? And I'm also like I'm more of a growth investor, so to me the lack of profitability isn't really an issue. With SoFi, it's a little bit different because SoFi does need to hit profitability so that they can grow their balance sheet. And so that will help them. Like with most growth companies, I would rather have them investing in marketing. And if you've got, like a high lifetime value over customer acquisition cost, then why not acquire a bunch more customers so that you become, so that you can grow faster and reap more benefits down the road. SoFi is a little different in that, like, in order for the bank to actually grow, they do need to be able to grow the balance sheet. In order for that to happen, like regulators require profits. So, um, but in general, like I'm still stoked about the investment. I think that it's probably about fairly valued for today's market, just where things are. But I think there's tons of things still to come. The one thing that I would say, like my what I consider the biggest risk right now for SoFi is probably just decelerating growth. So a lot of the growth in the past year has been based on just increasing the balance sheet, right? So they're holding a lot more loans, a lot more personal loans. They're high interest loans, and they make a crap ton off of it. Um, but they can only go so far with their balance sheet until they hit their capital ratios. And so I need to do the analysis. I haven't yet, but sometime in the next few quarters, they'll probably get to the point where they can't keep building their balance sheet. And so at that point, they need something else to take over to continue to grow the company at 30% plus, which is what I would hope they would do. So whether that's student loans, which I think will contribute quite a bit, or home loans, or their credit card business, or the one that I really want to take off is Galileo and their tech platform. But whatever it is, that next S curve of growth needs to kind of start taking over here in the next 6 to 9 months.
So I want to ask about a couple of those things. Student loans. Do you think originations are going to start to happen in Q3 or this quarter's results that are going to happen in November, or do you think it's going to take until 2024 to really see the extent of student loans, and what extent do you think that will have on the business? Is that a potential S curve of growth for SoFi?
I mean, I can't imagine it's not going to help, right? So I guess to answer your first question first, I think people are going to put things off as long as possible. That's kind of human nature. I would expect to see maybe a minor bump in the third quarter, but not too much. But I don't really know, right? This is just me spitballing. There was back in the fourth quarter of 2021, like the administration was pretty much saying, hey, student loans are going to come back in January, and they hit they got a pretty big bump in that quarter, which was before it actually came back. So I could see the third quarter going that way, but I think that rates are so high right now that people aren't in 2021 there was a bit of there was a bit of impetus there to refinance before rates maybe started to come back up. That impetus obviously is no longer there, right? And the other thing, and so I wrote an article with what I thought would happen with the student loans a little bit ago, but I think that was before Biden came out and basically took all the teeth out of not paying. So now if you don't pay your student loan, right, for until October of next year, they're not going to report you to any of the credit agencies. It'll accrue interest, but really there's no teeth, right? There's no real immediate consequence for not paying. And so I do think that will probably decrease originations relative to where they would have been if they didn't do that. But
Hi there.
hey, what's up, VITALY?
Nice to put a face to a Twitter profile.
You've never seen KRIS before?
I came on really briefly one time before when we talked about
did. He did. Yeah.
But,
okay.
VITALY, we were talking about how SoFi is your biggest position and how we love SoFi so much. VITALY, remember when you called SoFi a shitty bank and then KRIS single-handedly made you believe it wasn't a shitty bank?
And then he quickly sold out of it.
No, this KRIS, not that KRIS. This
I thought the other KRIS.
The other KRIS also sold out.
After he said that SoFi was going to be the stock that made him retire.
Yes, that's basically.
He's going 100 billion. I'm gone.
we all know who KRIS really is now. We understand when he's bullish on a stock, it's for a couple of weeks and then
Yeah. Anyway, that's funny. I thought that was funny. But I've been following you, and also I think Crossroads. You guys are posting some good DD on SoFi and PayPal. Are you doing PayPal too? No, you're not doing PayPal.
I've been posting DD. I'm not in PayPal. I can understand why people would be in, and I've considered taking a position a few times, but I haven't pulled the trigger yet.
Yeah,
I haven't had the time to really look into it, right? That's the big thing, is that I feel like I have to do some deeper due diligence before I would take a position, and I just haven't had time.
All right, so where are we at? What did you guys start at?
So we were just laying out some SoFi stuff. I want to do one quick more question on SoFi, and then we're going to go to Enphase energy and stuff like that. So last quick question, Galileo growth. This is the reason VITALY invested. It's the reason he got me interested in SoFi. It's kind of AWS of Fintech. Do you think the trajectory of that being a thing is still part of the thesis? And when do you think, if you had to project, we get some SaaS type multiples entering the stock because Galileo grows that much? Or do you think that never happens?
I mean, if they start getting good growth and it's consistent, then I think that happens, but I don't know exactly when that happens. So I guess as far as when the growth will come, it's really hard to project out, right? They've pivoted towards towards larger financial institutions. The sales timelines are much longer for them than all kind of the small neobanks they were going after. And I think, like, personally, I'm probably giving them until like the first quarter or second quarter of next year to really to see how this really plays out, right? Like, it's going to take time. I do think that it was good that this last quarter they actually hit an I guess it was an all-time high for the tech platform by just a small margin for revenue, but their contribution margin is still really low. So, I mean, what they've said is that they're going to see growth in the back half, at least in the fourth quarter, and that they're going to see margin expansion. So if they're able to do that, like, it's still going to take time to play out, but I don't think you'll probably see like SaaS multiples applied to them until like back half of 2024 if things work out really well. That's just my opinion.
Agreed.
Well,
Okay.
why do you say back
Go ahead,
half
Vitaly.
of 2024? You're assuming Galileo takes off in some sort of fundamental
Not
way? Because that's the only
not
thing I
really
would see
takes off.
happening.
No, okay, I wouldn't say a SaaS multiple, but like a higher multiple than a bank, right? Like, one of the things that
Okay.
people always say is that SoFi should be
So
valued
instead
as
of like instead of a 7 to 10 P somewhere in that range, that's what you're saying. We are going to like a 20, like a fintech, like a real fintech, 20, 30 plus.
Yeah, I think that, like, in order to demand a fintech multiple, right, you have to have something fintechy about you besides just being a better bank than everyone else.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, I'm sure you've heard me say this, but I don't like fintech. I think they have very little moat. But having said that, SoFi at $5 was like a no-brainer. So that's why after KRIS did I was already in SoFi, by the way, for a while. I've lost money on SoFi
Yeah, I knew that.
from 10 and down. Okay. So, and I was still in. And at 5, it was like, it was a no-brainer because it's like, look, either they're failing completely, which we know Noto is not failing. We see him growing and beating every single quarter. So he's doing what other startups are not doing. Do you know what I mean? So he's
Right.
actually beating all his projections all the time. So I saw opportunity. That's why I'm in it. But to say that I'm fascinated with banking, the banking sector, and to be in that, no. But having said that, I keep referring to AWS, and that's why I think Amit and I had this conversation years ago, at this point, a year and a half ago, probably, about SoFi. If the AWS of Fintech is real, that's where all the money is going to be made. Like, that's where this multiple expansion you're talking about, that's where it happens. But we need to see that start to grow. And right now, I think it's flatlined, right? It's not shrinking anymore, but it's sort of flatlined.
Yeah, it flatlined and then it went down and then it came back up to basically the same flat line. And
it's flatlined, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Shout out to Josh for a $10 super chat. This guy has millions in SoFi, especially June 2024 $10 calls. So this stock better be above $10 by June 2024. And if it's at like 15, Josh is going to do very well next year. So, nice. KRIS, I'm going to put you on the spot right here. What do you think SoFi ends the year at in terms of its price?
I suck at price predictions, man. You did me dirty.
You do, because on before Q1 earnings, you said SoFi is going to be GAAP profitable, and they were not GAAP profitable. But I think you did the numbers wrong in your head or something. And
no, so I ran those numbers. So I guess I can defend myself a little bit.
Well, while he figures it out, just want to point out, nobody knows the price at the end of the year of anything. Just want to point that out. Okay,
that's true.
That's why we're financial analysts on YouTube, Vitaly. We get to guess.
Obviously. If Peter Lynch can't guess the price, me and you.
Bro, why do you keep bringing up Peter Lynch? That guy's from like
because I love that guy.
Like, dude, he's the best. Go read his
ridiculous.
I'm acting like KRIS right now. I'm acting like KRIS.
Ridiculous. If you don't actually follow the greats like him, then absolutely you're going to be the worst investor ever. You have to follow the people who came before you, who proved the way, who have the model of success. You have to follow those people.
Okay, KRIS, what is SoFi by the end of the year so I can buy it?
Okay, real quick, let me go back. So the numbers that I
follow
posted,
Amit into DNA. That's what I'll follow.
There you go.
Okay.
Those numbers I did like before fourth quarter 2022 numbers came out, right? So they're like really old projections that I did that I just reposted because somebody asked me about them. But I didn't think that, so I actually thought that the stock would be profitable in third quarter of this year. I'm not sure if that's going to happen still. They could if they pulled back on marketing. But where it ends the year, that's going to be before profitability because you won't have the fourth quarter numbers out. I don't know, somewhere around 10 to 12.
That's exactly what I think.
I'm guessing.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, that makes sense because if they're getting closer and closer and the market is doing some sort of a turnaround, right? I think it will. I think we're going to all-time high. So if that's happening, SoFi is going to do well.
Yep.
Christopher Patel, thank you for joining us. Your alter ego, KRIS Data Driven Investing, who uses data to drive his investing, not whatever Chris Patel
Not
uses.
gut feeling.
Chris is like, yeah, I'm up 100%, so shut the fuck up. Okay, so that's the SoFi discussion. We're gonna transition on to energy. Chris and VITALY have been going back and forth all weekend on this energy discussion. It's been very entertaining for all of us that have been following them go back and forth. A little bit of trolling on each side. Chris, Lululemon doing better than Enphase. It's really interesting what's going on right now. But let's start the discussion here. Chris, data-driven investing. Do you have a position in Enphase? If you don't, why don't you have a position in Enphase? And because your professional life is in the climate change world, if you can give us some background on that, how do you think about the overall mission of what Enphase is trying to do?
What is your professional life? Am I missing something?
So I'm a chemical engineer, and I work in the energy industry. So my since graduating, I've been working on a carbon capture technology, so doing R&D on it. But I like, for example, today, like I went and I toured a coal-fired power plant that we're doing like a feasibility study for, right? So like I worked with all kinds of stuff in the energy industry. The company that acquired us back in 2020 is really big into LNG, liquefied natural gas, I guess, if people don't know what that is. And so like it's my, so despite the fact that I write more about SoFi than anything else, one of the reasons for that is that like I don't want to write about specific energy companies because they're competitors, right? And so there's like conflicts of interest there.
Right.
But
are you allowed to talk about it?
Enphase.
Are you allowed to talk about these companies
in general? So like I won't mention specific companies like that are direct competitors of. So I work for a company called Chart Industries. And I probably won't get into those, but like Enphase is certainly not. So we don't do renewables, or solar or wind or anything like that. So I do own an Enphase position, to answer your question, Amit. I always kind of wanted to, but it was always too frothy, the valuation. But recently, that hasn't been as big of a problem since they've pulled down so much. So it's a pretty small position, but I am building it out. So it's one of the names that I'm like dollar cost averaging into right now.
I know. I mean, why besides my thesis, what is your due diligence on Enphase that even made you buy anything? But being in the like, it sounds like you're mostly in oil and gas industry. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, that's the main. Yeah, oil and gas is the companies in oil and gas, right? But I follow. So like energy is something that I've worked in, followed, am interested in, right? Like it's part of who I am. And so in general, you're right in that things are pivoting towards solar. I do think that Tony Seba and other people are a little too bullish on things. I think that some of the aspects, kind of like from a macro perspective, like an energy macro perspective, some of the things that like people say, like him, and some of the things that like you and Carlos have said are probably not quite, like I don't think things are quite as bullish as you guys think they are. But in general, like
so which part can you
sure.
Actually name specific things, and then I'd like to hear it.
Okay, so first, like Tony Seba thought, like back in his 2018, like the one that's on YouTube that everybody's seen, right? It was given in like 2018, and he basically said they'd be doubling every 2 years. So if they followed the timeline he was talking about, we'd be at like 12% penetration right now as far as solar goes, and we're just over 5%, right? So it's just the timelines of like the fact that it is an S curve, right? And but it's not happening on the same timeline that he predicted. And just in general, there is, so the bigger picture, I think that
I see what you're saying, but he's usually
always,
only a few years behind in any of his projections. And he's been projecting since 2012 different things, or 2010 in terms of EV adoption and everything. He's sort of gotten around the ballpark of his numbers. Like EVs, he said by 2020 and 2010 that they would be at a certain percentage. And they were roughly that. Like Tesla, that's when Tesla started taking off. You know what I mean? So
he might be uber bullish. The trajectory is right, but the timeline's a little off. And then, but the second part is so from a bigger picture perspective, there is kind of a glass ceiling as far as how far renewables can go before they actually start becoming less economical for the entire grid. And so like Germany's a great example, right? So Germany in early 2000s started this thing that they call the Energiewende, which I don't know what it translates to in English, like something like the energy revolution or whatever. And so, but the so they went really hard into both wind and solar. And Germany's energy cost, so they put in something, it was like 1% of their GDP for the last 5 years has gone into renewables. It'd be like the equivalent of like, I don't know, what is it, like $250 billion a year in the US. So they put like, it was like $32 billion per year into wind and solar and all these renewable sources, and their energy prices have gone up. And Germany's energy prices, despite the fact, so they've got more renewables, which again, if you think that renewables are cheaper, and that solar is the cheapest form of energy, which it depends on what numbers you look at, but it's close, right? And it does make sense. It makes a ton of sense in residential. I have no, like, I completely agree in that
Are you
aspect.
saying it
But as
doesn't
far
make
as like
sense in
controlling the
commercial?
entire, I don't think it makes sense in commercial and industrial, because by the time that you get to the point at which you have that sort of market penetration, you're putting too much stress on the grid. And in order to balance that stress, it actually increases the total cost of energy. So electricity, I guess, electricity in Germany is 45% higher than the rest of the European Union, despite the fact that they have all of the cheapest electricity on their grid.
Well, I'm
And so
looking at just
part
the
of that
stat.
is
They actually
because,
have 46.2% of German electricity is clean energy, renewable energy.
yeah, no, and they count biomass as part of their clean energy,
Okay.
which, depending on how you feel about biomass, you can or cannot count it. But and part of that reason is because, so there's two big reasons. Number one, it's energy dilute, right? So like the coal-fired power plant that I went to today has a steam turbine, and it's literally inside of it's probably about 20 feet by 60 feet, and you get 220 megawatts out of that steam turbine, right?
So the
Like
actual
the
space
footprint of the
constraint,
steam.
the footprint is
So
small.
yeah, the footprint's
Right.
really, really small, like relative to, in order to get, like it's 500 times more energy dense or something like that to have a kind of fossil or nuclear plant than it is to have solar. And so like the first like fundamental reason that like solar can't get up past a certain level is the footprint that it needs. And then the second one is just the fact that you can't turn it on and off. And batteries help with
I
that.
want to, wait, I just want to
Well,
interrupt.
number
there.
one. Yeah,
Wait,
number
wait,
one.
wait. I want to interrupt it because you're okay. You're saying, and by the way, it's nice to meet you, Chris. I was looking.
Yeah, good to
forward
meet you,
conversation.
Carlos.
Okay, so you're saying that within a certain footprint, this is how much energy that this device generates, right? But what you're not counting is all of where did the coal come from to feed into that system? Yeah. What was the energy required to mine and transport the coal that was necessary to fire that device? One of the things that I and this is something that whenever I talk to people that talk about gas or coal, the idea of solar or wind is that you capture the energy close to the source of consumption, and you can store that energy in a battery. And with enough batteries, which do require mining but are either recyclable or rechargeable, the cost over time goes down. So yes, this coal-fired plant in a small space can do that. But what happens when you run out of coal? Or what happens when the coal that you need to get is further and further away? You still need to bring the resources to this device to do this. And ultimately, if you think long-term, if humans were to escape the planet, if we have a base on the moon, if we have, if we say terraform Mars or we try to occupy Mars, what's the energy source that's going to be used predominantly? It's either going to be nuclear or it's going to be solar. None of these energy sources are viable outside of the Earth.
What are you talking about? We're going to go find coal on Mars, and that is what's happening.
Dig it up.
No, you're right.
If you tried to do that on Mars, you would if you try to do that, say on Mars or the moon, you would say this is incredibly inefficient to have to bring something from somewhere else to be able to create energy locally.
So hold on. Before you guys go on, first and foremost, we're not running out of coal anytime soon. Okay. And if you look at the energy density of what coal is, it's a lot higher than most people think. Right.
But also
and
look
because, at but hold on. Let me finish. And because you have such a lack of, additional uses for coal, the price of coal has dropped off precipitously. Okay. One of the best investments
for a ton of coal than you pay for a ton of dirt. Literally, it costs them less to get a ton of coal. The thing is, it's like $2 for a ton.
Yeah.
I'm not questioning that.
And also, I just want to say, Carlos, you're absolutely right. The future is definitely solar. All right. But it's going to take another 15 to 20 years before that becomes a bigger reality. You're not if you're trying to invest for, like, let's say, my investing plan is for 20 35, you will probably come out ahead. Okay. But that's literally like 12 years away. Coal is what's available today. Most people in most economies are going to use coal today. Right. So the thing is, you don't want to overpay for technology way out into the future for something that's not going to happen like as quickly as people are thinking.
Well,
so yes, I agree with guys like Tony Seba, and I'm sure KRIS agrees with him too. But the timeline is way more stretched out than people would like to believe.
If we're talking about from an investment standpoint, then that's different. But if we're having a conversation about the energy sources in general, then I think that's a different conversation, and that's the conversation I'm having. Enough solar energy.
So let me go back to the original kind of fundamental question. So wait.
Before you leave the coal thing, I just wanted to know how many coal plants are being built right now. You correct me if this is incorrect. I'm looking at EIA.gov. As of September 2022, developers have not reported any plans to build new U.S. coal-fired capacity in the future. This is
there's
I mean, that's KRIS, that shut down you 100%. No matter what you say, the reality is everybody is transitioning to solar and wind and renewables.
Okay, but one
second.
Okay, so let's
over 50%. Hold on. Hey, hold on.
Let VITALY get it.
Yeah. Over 50% of the current projects in 2023 are all renewables and nothing to do with coal. Okay, so those are just the facts. Go ahead.
Okay, so let's actually let KRIS speak now. He's the guest from the pod. Let him lay out his case, and then you guys can go out. Go ahead, KRIS.
So I'm not arguing that coal is the future. Let me get this completely straight. Carlos is 100% right. So we're moving to renewables. We're moving to nuclear. If we are concerned about climate change, nuclear should form the base load of everything that we do moving forward.
Agree.
And then solar has a really, really important niche, especially in residential. It makes all the sense in the world, as you guys have talked about, right? Like because of the subsidies and everything else, I've got solar panels on my roof, right? Like
you don't get coal panels on the roof. You know
no, you don't get coal panels.
Nobody have coal panels?
Again, let the guest speak, please. Let him talk. You guys spent 2 hours talking about Enphase yesterday. Let him lay out his case. Then go ahead.
So
you weren't even on the pod yesterday, so calm yourself down a bit, okay?
All right. We got to let KRIS talk, please.
Dude,
go ahead.
Honestly, calm it down, okay? No joke. Go ahead, KRIS.
Yeah, I'm not joking, but we have a guest and he needs to speak. So please let data-driven investing give data-driven investing analysis. Go ahead.
So like, for example, the coal plant that I visited today, again, it was like they broke ground on it in 1963 and it's still running at the same efficiency that it was built back then, right? Like a solar panel in 60 years isn't going to have the same efficiency that it does right now. Now they put in other things to clean it up and they have like FGDs and scrubbers and everything else. But the point is that like, we don't actually even need to build more coal plants in order to continue to have the same electricity output from coal that we do right now. And again, I don't think coal is the future. Like, fundamentally speaking, think about it this way. 200 years ago, what was the biggest energy problem in the world? So 200 years ago, the biggest problem with energy density in the world was poop, literally, because we used animals to run our farms. We used animals to pull us around. And so if you think 200 years out in the future, that we're going to have to be dealing with coal, that's not the problem. Like when you think about energy, you need to think about how to get through the next 20 years because humans are really innovative. And in 20 years, the entire industry is going to look completely different from the way that it does right now, right? Like nobody cares about horse crap anymore. But that was a big energy problem, was getting rid of horse crap from the roads in London. Right? Like that was a thing that people legitimately thought about. And when they talked about like humans would never be able to achieve this and that and the other, it's because they said, well, we can't pull plows with anything but oxen, and oxen can only output this much, right? Like if you talk to like scientists from back then. So like look at 20 to 50 years ahead, and yes, you guys are completely right. Like nobody's going to build any more coal plants because they're dirty, because they are like they do end up costing more in the long term and other things. But I guess if you're talking about investing, I can kind of bring it back to like the fact that it's supposed to be finance junkies, right? I think that solar has a really big room to grow, but I think that the growth is capped a little bit lower than kind of the biggest bulls think, and that needs to be taken into account because you have to integrate into a grid. And the reason that you have to integrate into a grid is because nobody in the world thinks about turning on nobody in the developed world, like all of us take for granted the fact that every single time we flip a switch, the lights come on, right? And when you think about the fact that that has to happen in every single house in the United States, like that is a huge amount of infrastructure that's been put on. And like, for example, in my house, like even if I have battery backup in the winter time, like this, we got huge storms. I live in Utah, right? We got huge storms and there was no solar for like 5 or 6 days. The point at which like we've become so dependent on electricity that even if you have battery storage, the second that that turns off and your lights turn off, or you can't run your heat pump or anything else, you are going to pay whatever it takes for an electric company to turn your power back on, right? Like microgrids are a great idea until something hits that shuts them down. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you've got like what's going on in California, where the grid goes down, and if you don't have solar backup, then you're screwed, right? And so there's two sides to this argument, right? But the point is that like increasing renewables to up to a certain point is really, really beneficial for the grid and lowers grid costs. But past a certain point, the fact that they're not dispatchable, that you can't turn them on and off exactly when you want them, increases the cost for the entire grid. And so that's why I think that there's just fundamentally speaking, there's an upper limit to how much renewables you can get into a system and not have it start to increase the cost of electricity. Does that make sense?
It does. But I think and I agree with a lot of the points that you're making. I actually am kind of in the middle about this as I've been researching this a lot more. I think the people that are bullish on the renewables are over exaggerating some of the climate and financial impact of the fossil fuel industry. And I think the fossil fuel industry is over downplaying the whatever is like lack of efficiency or power output of that technology. I think that what we're seeing is the introduction of solar, and right now solar and renewables are being seen as the backup to a primarily fossil fuel grid. And I think slowly we'll see a 50%, we'll see that crossover 50%, because most residential people like VITALY will have a gas powered generator. Yes, I do think that's the answer. That's the solution if the renewables fail. But I don't think that because you need the fossil fuels as a backup, that it means that renewables aren't the solution. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, the issue is that you have to have 100% backup is the issue, unless you've got batteries, right? So batteries can absorb them a little bit, but like an entire battery system for like a really large grid is too big because of the commercial and industrial sources. So again, for your residential, for like to run your AC and your refrigerator and everything that you and I need, isn't that much, right? But if you want to be able to, run large manufacturing plants off of batteries, the batteries are there's too many of them that you need. There's too much, like the energy density just isn't enough to be able to run it for more than an hour or two.
Well, this is where I agree with you that I think nuclear is the solution for that. I'm not saying that batteries and solar are the solution to everything, but I do think that we need to move away from the traditional burning of fossil fuels, whether it's coal or gasoline, because what happens is you have this problem of sourcing. This is the big problem, is sourcing the material from somewhere else. And even as a matter of like national security, every country gets solar. Every country, the sun falls on every country, and it is a way for that country to become energy independent. And sure, if you have to source backups to your primary source of power, that's different. But I think even for us as a country, I mean, I think they calculated a 100 square mile solar array system with the current output of the wattages would power the United States, the entire United States. Now, I'm not saying that we need to do that, but I'm just saying that's how relatively small amount of solar you need to capture in order to power the United States. Enough solar falls on the earth per day that is equivalent to the Earth's entire energy consumption for a year. There's free energy raining down very close to the sources that it needs to be consumed. I just don't think we're maximizing that right now.
So to push back a little, I actually looked up the figures. You need, so if you were to put all the solar panels in Arizona, in the sunniest part of Arizona at max output, you'd need a solar farm the size of Maryland in order to get to do all of the electricity needs of the United States, if you include residential and commercial and industrial, right? So that's huge, like it's massive.
100 square miles is what I heard. 100 square miles.
So Elon's calculation's bullshit. 100 square miles.
Elon's calculation, well, yes, because he has a vested interest in making sure that everybody. So it was about 60% bigger, I think. So I actually went through and I didn't do the math myself, but I went through people who did critiques of Elon's stuff, and like went back through and checked their assumptions, and I think that they're valid, right? That's not my number. That's somebody else's number. But
Well, okay,
I do
so
think that Elon was a little ambitious.
I do want to agree with you on the fact that, yes, we're not going to run heavy machinery in big factories right now for batteries. That's not happening. But the tide is clear that almost everything else that doesn't need, like large semi trucks. I know Tesla has it, but maybe those will run on hydrogen. Maybe that's what's going to be the fuel.
No, those
the
will
future
run on batteries because hydrogen is.
No, that's fine. I mean, I'm just making a point. Forget about the actual thing.
Yeah.
Maybe
I'm
big
sorry.
machinery will run on something else. Maybe large factories will continue to run on oil, but everything else will not. That's the point. The point is right now, currently, even with these statistics coming out, over 50% of current projects that are in development, they're all renewable. And I know somebody corrected, but all renewable, whether it's wind, solar, hydro, whatever. That doesn't matter. The point is, this is happening now. This is not a 10 years from now. This is now the projects that are being planned, possibly happening in the next couple of years, 5 years that they're building, all renewables. This is just going to keep increasing. And back to the point for the home. Oh, so I want to say that, yes. So let's say we're at a point where we're over 50% renewables for homes and small industrial or small commercial, whatever. And then we're using the backup gas-powered, oil-powered plants, coal-powered plants for the large stuff, or the times when we're actually having, because batteries won't be enough. Fine, I'll take that thing. But I think it's just going to switch to those being the backup and not being the actual main source of energy like we have right now. What do you think about that?
The problem is that since you need, the problem is that since you need 100% backup, like you either need to have batteries that can power things, but if 50% of your stuff is coming from, or 50% of your electricity is coming from solar, for example, and then all of a sudden you've got a cloudy day, right? And it gets down to say 10% instead of 50%. That 40% gap you have to make up with stuff that can respond on the order of minutes. And so,
well, hold on. Batteries are not going away. Batteries aren't going away, but they're not going to last for maybe days and days, like you were saying. So maybe that's the issue, that we're going to have instant power that happens with the batteries that comes in. But if you needed something more sustained, there could be a backup gas generator, backup oil generator. Why not?
Sure, but the problem with that is that you have to spend the capex to build that thing, right? So they're called peaking plants. They run off of natural gas. This is how they do it right now, right? Because you have to match a utility has to match exactly the demands of the grid. Otherwise, you either get rolling blackouts or you overpower the grid, right? The fact that we can do that at all is actually pretty darn cool.
Yeah.
But like the way that they do that is with these things called peaking plants. So they've got gas turbines, and you can ramp them up and down in a matter of minutes, and they can give you megawatts worth of, like 100 megawatts worth of energy, right? And so, but the issue is that, like, if you're 50% solar, it means that you have to have the infrastructure to have 50% peaking plants, 50% of these natural gas peaking plants, so that when the solar comes offline, you can pick that up immediately. And there's nothing else that can ramp that quickly to make up that difference.
Oh, but,
so,
but
like,
I'm sorry, but
so
there's a really simple solution to that. I mean, with enough of these like mega packs, right? You use the mega packs as a buffer. So if the grid is draining the mega packs, you basically run them like the way that you run a Prius, right, or a hybrid car. The hybrid car's gas engine charges the battery. When the battery gets too low, or as it gets to a critical point, the gas engine will fire up to start charging that battery back into a point of usability. So they'll have plenty of a line of sight. When if you see if I'm just saying right now, if you had to say a bunch of mega packs per neighborhood, and suddenly the sun goes out, or it's raining, or whatever it is, and people are consuming more than the battery can replace in a specific amount of time, it's very easy to ramp up another source that you're talking about, natural gas or an oil-fired plant or a coal-fired plant, to start refilling the battery. Basically, you use the massive battery as the buffer, so you never have to have this situation where you have to ramp up within 4 or 5 minutes. That's just not smart anyway. So you just have a massive battery that is the buffer.
And also, by the way, they have these peaker plants anyway. They don't have to destroy all of them. They already have the peaker plants built, correct?
No, but the point is you have to build a ton more, right? So right now, the peaker plants are like, they're the most expensive electricity that you can get. It's like, you're talking about, typically, what do you guys pay in terms of energy? We only pay like 8 cents a kilowatt in Utah,
it's 8
right?
cents,
Like, it's really cheap
out here,
right? 8 to 22 cents. Peaker plants cost like $50 a kilowatt. because you had to pay for the capex, but you only run them when you need that marginal amount of electricity. And so the issue is that like you still have to have the infrastructure built in order to, so even if you can slowly ramp down, like you still have to have some sort of backup that can ramp up, and you have to pay the capex for whatever that backup source is.
Well,
and
let
so
me
right now,
respond.
you'd have
Let me respond to
you'd
that.
have
If it's
build
$50
a ton more
if
peakers.
well, the thing is, then it makes sense financially to build the battery peaker plants and just get rid of the gas-fired ones. If you are saying there's such a massive incentive to do that.
But it's even more expensive to build the battery packs to be able to do like a 24-hour, let's see, I wrote this down. Let me check my stuff.
While you're researching that though, but again, every time you go and source a fossil fuel that needs to be burned and consumed once, every time you need more of it, you need to go back and source more of it. So even if
that's cheap.
But I'm saying, but even if the cost of mining the materials needed for a battery are twice as expensive, or 3 times as expensive, the fact that you can recycle that, and basically you mine those raw materials once and they can continually be recycled, or in this case, recharged over and over and over for thousands of cycles, the cost of the sourcing is divided over the life of usage. And so, and you never have to go source it again. So in other words, every piece of lithium or the cobalt that we mine from the earth, we're never going to need to mine it again, and it just adds to the stockpile, and we can continuously use them and move them around.
So let me quote some numbers. So if you wanted to power the entire grid off of renewables and batteries, it would cost about $23 trillion to do it, to build it up front, which is more than the US GDP, right? It's like $1 trillion more than, well, it's probably these are 2018 numbers. So it's the US GDP is higher than that right now. But to answer your other question, Carlos, so if you look at, let me pull that other stuff up. So solar only returns 1.6x the power required to make the panels and the materials. So if you look over that 20-year lifetime, the amount of energy that you get out of a solar panel is something around 2x what you put into it. Whereas the amount that you get out of a coal-fired power plant is 30x. So the amount of mining and stuff that goes into, so if you spend 1 kilowatt of power, that's not there, 1 kilojoule of energy in order to pull coal out of a coal mine and get it to the plant, you get 30 kilojoules out of it. Whereas if you spend 1 kilojoule of energy to mine all the stuff for solar and to build the panels, you only get 2 kilojoules over the entire lifetime, assuming a 20-year lifetime. If they last longer than that, then everything else is great. So that's part of this energy density.
Panels, okay, once again, we talked about this even on an episode. Panels are 40 years, okay, not 20 years. And there is degradation, you're right. It can even last up to 100 years. So your 100% efficiency drops to 70% efficiency. And the other thing you keep discounting is that batteries are on a cost curve to 70% less than today. So are the solar panels, because you can produce it in a factory. Once again, if they're making a widget in a factory, it's just going to keep getting cheaper and cheaper. So even right now, it's cheaper. I don't know why we're arguing about this right now, because it's already cheaper. But imagine in 5 years, the cost curve that we're actually riding down, it's going to be incredibly inexpensive to do this. This is not even going to be, this is going to be a no-brainer for most commercial projects to just do this. It's already happening. So I don't know where this discussion of like it's cheaper and more energy efficient.
But it sounds like you just made the case for why it's not a good investment, because it's going to keep getting cheaper and cheaper. Why would you want to be in a business that keeps getting cheaper and cheper?
Because as it gets cheaper and cheaper.
Oh my God.
Because as it gets cheaper and cheaper.
Wow, I don't even know what to say to that. That's
it's because it's the same as Tesla lowering the price. Every $1,000 that they lower the price, they get an exponentially more demand. So if you lower the price to virtually nothing, virtually everybody will be able to have.
But you also destroy your own operating margins. Oh, that doesn't make sense.
It's never going to be zero. It's never going to be zero. And you also have the other infrastructure that goes around it. It's not just the actual panels themselves.
So
right?
even if, by the way, I'll take the bear case. Even if he's right, the point is still getting cheaper. Okay. Even if the operating margins go down, which they won't, or they'll go down not as much as Chris thinks. Even if that happens, by the way, it doesn't matter. The point is someone's going to produce something in a factory that's cheaper that they can sell 1 million of, as opposed to go dig it up, drive it somewhere else, put it in another thing, and burn it over there. Then
China
will
do it.
Well, the cost
of whoever does it. By the way, whoever does it, doesn't matter. Somebody's going to do it, and it's going to be more affordable than doing another coal fire plant, which is not happening anymore. Oil fire plants, it's going to slow down. This is all happening in real time right now. So I don't know what the discussion is here that it's not happening. Like, what is the...
That there's I think that so I'm a solar bull. I'm an Enphase bull. I own stock.
You're just saying it'll take
right?
longer.
Like, I'm just saying that the upside, like there is a ceiling that we're going to hit, and it's something that like needs to be taken into account in the investing thesis.
Fine.
When
We're at
you say-
5% penetration.
But I have a question. When you say ceiling, do you mean a ceiling in terms of adaptation, a ceiling in terms of penetration? Overall?
Penetration.
So, okay. So, and you're saying on the residential side, so right now we're at 5%. What do you see as like the ceiling realistically of a residential penetration?
If you talk about the full grid, you're probably talking about somewhere around 20 to 30% renewables is when things start to get a little dicey.
And 20 to 30% of renewables on the grid for residential.
No, this is so in Germany, it's for like, I'm comparing this to Germany where they're talking about not just residential, right?
Okay.
And so like, and that's where there is tons of room for Enphase and Solar Edge and a bunch of other solar stocks to go to the moon before we get to this point, right? Like it's more of a, again, the discussion was more of a, people say things like oil is going to zero, we're never going to use fossil fuels again. Like when I hear stuff like that, it makes me like, people don't realize that if we did that, their modern way of living would go to zero, right? Like,
I agree with you. 100%. I agree with you.
Yeah, but there's still tons of room, and there are. I worry about extending the cost curves the way that they had been extended. I think that a big part of what has driven the cost reductions in solar is the fact that microchip manufacturing has gotten so good. Like semiconductors are just so much better than they have. And semiconductors at this point, they're to the point at which like we're talking about like single or a few layers of atoms that they're working with now. Like they've gotten so darn good at manufacturing semiconductors that there's very little more that they can do at this point besides going to quantum computing, right? That's the next great leap as far as compute power. That's where, like, if Moore's law continues, I think it's going to take quantum computing to do it. And so I worry, and I don't know this very well, right? But I worry that most of the gains that were inside of solar were because of gains that they were able to piggyback off of the semiconductor industry. And the semiconductor industry has gotten to the point where it's so good that I'm not sure how many gains there are left in that system.
Interesting take. I obviously don't agree, but
I think, look, I think if the entire planet operated for what was just the best for the planet, I think we would all be a combination of nuclear and renewables. I don't think that we would be doing any fossil fuels. I think that we would see nuclear as the most efficient power output for the footprint and the least amount of waste, plus solar as backing up. Because if you look at what you have to use to power yourself in outer space, where you cannot lose power. You can't lose power in outer space, and you can't lose power in a submersible, in a submarine underwater. Okay, you can't. If you do, you're dead. So what do? They use nuclear power, right? Because that's it, and it's also the least waste, and it doesn't require you to go sourcing more materials to keep the engine going. And in outer space, what do? They use solar power, or in a combination of nuclear. So if you look at that, when you absolutely cannot lose power, those are the two energy sources that we use. Now here we have other options with varying degrees of convenience and trade-offs like emissions. But I think eventually, if we just did what was the best thing for the planet and looked to space and underwater, you'd say, look, the best thing is to have nuclear power plants and a combination of solar. So we distribute our energy risk and also have the best benefit of power to waste.
So for electricity, I 100% agree. Like the issue is that like well over half of the electricity, or well over half the energy that we use is not in the form of electricity. Right. So like, how are you going to build cement out of electricity? Right. You need heat. You need a ton of heat, and running electric heaters in order to generate that heat is really, really inefficient. Right. And all of a sudden we're talking about the amount of electricity we need going like
I follow you.
No, so it's 5 or 6x.
So how much energy? That's a good thing you're bringing up. How much energy is used for this big industrial processes versus everybody else who's just driving in a car, who has a house, who has a small business,
Nuclear generates a ton of heat. I mean, nuclear generates.
No, I'm just wondering
But
what
you
is
need
what
a-
is the
You need
percentage
like a
of the energy
nuclear
used?
plant next to a cement plant, right? Or next to a lime kiln, or next to a bunch of these other things, right?
Or metallurgical plants like steel and stuff. There's just
Yeah,
too
of
much
course.
energy
Steel and
required. To
cement.
make
All right.
those
So what are they? So right
Agreed.
now, what is the current primary energy source of those things that they build locally around these where it's needed?
metallurgical coal. For steel, it's
you-
metallurgical coal, and
You
for
burn coal or
uh,
natural gas.
yeah,
You
Which is
burn a
fine.
fossil fuel, right? So like, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think there's something along the lines of it's about 40% of our energy goes to electricity generation, and the other 60% is for all this other stuff that we do.
Everything else.
And so that's why that's why oil's not going to zero. Even if like tomorrow you could snap your fingers and say, we've converted every single electric thing that we do to either nuclear or solar or wind or something renewable, oil's still not going to zero, because we still have to make fertilizer, and we still have to make steel, and we still have to make cement, and we still have to make plastics, and we still have to, like our modern way of life is absolutely dependent on fossil fuels for the time being. And maybe we can fix that.
And what
at some
about
point,
just
right?
natural gas and hydrogen?
Hydrogen's
natural gas and
another.
hydrogen?
Hydrogen
I
has
think
some other set of problems.
hydrogen. If you're trying to split it using electricity, is even worse, because you're using a process called electrolysis, which takes way more energy, and you lose a shit ton
once
of
again, if
efficiency.
solar goes very low and very cheap, and these gross margins compress, people will start making hydrogen this way. That's what's going to happen.
No, it's
I'm not
But
saying
the
it's
issue-
efficient
so the
for
issue with
EVs.
hydrogen,
What I'm saying is
and-
maybe it's efficient for the actual larger commercial.
No, it's really inefficient. And in order to transport hydrogen, they bond it to make ammonia so that it's not as combustible. And then they have to get rid of it. But the byproduct is that the nitrogen that they remove from that, they can use that to make fertilizer. There's a bunch of ways to do it, but still, it's very energy.
Which is why we have a chemical
Super
engineer
energy.
here. Which is why we have a
Right.
chemical engineer who can tell us that, right?
So
Chris?
so hydrogen. The other issue with so Carlos is right on. So hydrogen, the infrastructure for hydrogen is like ridiculous, because if
Yeah.
you think the infrastructure for natural gas was hard to build, like try doing the very smallest molecule on the periodic table, right? The hydrogen leaks out of
It
everything.
leaks out of everything, right? Yeah.
Steel,
It's
yeah,
it's
it brittle
corrosive.
steel
It's
and-
corrosive.
yeah, it's the
Highly
worst.
combustible. I mean, there's a
Yeah,
lot.
So,
so-
well,
so you do
just a
have
good
to make
question.
them-
Why are they even trying to do
you
this?
gotta confirm it. Because
So why is
there's
Toyota
energy
trying
money.
to make hydrogen cars?
Energy out.
Because there's lots of money and it sounds good, right? Like imagine you can put something into your car and the only effluent that comes out the back end is water. Doesn't that sound magical?
It does sound.
It does, right?
Yeah,
Like,
it
and so
does.
people get really, really excited about hydrogen and have been for the last 60 years, and nobody can make it work because it, like, the technical challenges
Toyota's
are
going to
just
make it work, apparently.
so hard, right? Like Toyota, I'm a
do.
hydrogen bear. We'll put it that way, right? Like you can make it into ammonia, but then you've got to burn ammonia, right? And then you've got to clean up the NOx and other things that come with that. And
I heard that they take the they take the nitrogen from
or
that,
you then
that's what
have
they
to
use to make
convert,
fer-
yeah.
and then they use that to make fertilizer, which is a huge part of the reason why we can sustain the population we do once they started infusing agriculture with nitrogen, which is like also
No,
critical
that's
in
true.
atmosphere.
But the ammonia that goes into fertilizer, if you don't want to use it for fertilizer, what are you going to do with the ammonia? You either have to burn it,
clean
or you have to
bathroom.
put it back into hydrogen and
Or you
nitrogen,
could turn it
and then
into
you have to pour
bombs.
it in a-
Or you could turn
or
it
you-
into bombs, baby. TNT.
I mean, come on.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But back to the original point, or at least my first point about. I hear what you're saying, and I do think that we can get to a point where basically everything that doesn't have to be this, that doesn't have to be, say, fossil fuel based because of the energy required, can be switched over to renewables. But again, I think that there's just a problem with the narrative, and I think the people that are bullish on the renewables it's not even their fault. They've bought into this narrative that, like, we are in a climate crisis, we are in a climate boiling, they call it now. But I started looking at the numbers, right? So in terms of all of the emissions on the planet, and correct me if I'm wrong, the United States is 15% of the entire global emissions. Okay, 30% of those emissions are what they call transport, but that's all transport. That includes all of the semis. That includes all of the airline travel, which produces a fuck ton of emissions, and semi trucks produce a ton of emissions as well. So when you think about the amount of emissions that passenger vehicles are emitting as a percentage of the United States, and then as a percentage of the world, it's actually a very, very, very small amount of emissions. And so it does make a dent, but it is not. It is not the life-changing, life-altering, climate-stopping event. Even if you do go and get an EV and you're charging on the grid, you know?
Yeah, so we could get it. Climate change, I can talk on forever, but I won't, because that really is my wheelhouse, right? But the point is that, and you're right. Like, if you look at these things, like that, there's so much of it that we have to take care of. So here's my, I guess, the 2-minute spiel on climate change is like, this is essentially what I've spent my life doing, is trying to find technical solutions to emission problems, right? Like that's what I do. And so climate change is not an existential problem for humanity in the near term. And I think people who try to make it that way are doing a disservice to everyone, because they're taking away from things that are actually more important than climate change is. So climate change is a big long tail risk, and it's something that we need to technically solve, and that we will technically solve, because humans are really innovative, humans are really resilient, and it's going to take time, and it's going to take technology development. But the reason, for example, you don't ever hear about like acid rain anymore, right? Because we solved it, because we found innovative technical solutions that solved it, right? That was a huge problem in the 70s that everybody was worried about.
Mhm.
You don't hear about the hole in the ozone layer, which is something that I, as a kid,
The
so I'm a
CFCs,
millennial,
yeah.
right? I'm not as young as Amit. I'm not quite as old as Carlos and Vitali, right? But like the hole in the ozone layer was a huge deal when I was younger. You don't hear about it anymore. Why? Because we found suitable alternative refrigerants that made it so that we didn't have to put these CFCs out into the atmosphere anymore. We're going to solve climate change. Now, climate change is a bigger problem than either of those, right? It's a much difficult thing to tackle, but we'll innovate our way out of it because we have time, and because we realize that this is a problem in the long term, and we do need to find technical solutions for it.
And we've got guys like KRIS in the background actually solving these issues. That's
Yeah,
one
I
of the
mean, like
key,
I said, I've spent a dozen years working on this, right? And there's lots of things like, and again, like, it's not, I guess, on this point, right? The fact that I visited a coal plant today means that that coal plant is actually looking at solutions, and they're paying us to do a study to capture their CO2, because this is something that's also important to them, right? Like, it's people think that people inside the energy industry, that we're all like, that everybody in oil and gas is just has like
Burn it all,
blindfolds on,
burn it, right?
and is burn it all, and
Yeah,
like
burn-
oil forever. No, we're not. Like, we're real humans too, right? Like, maybe there are some, crazy capitalists, and I'm sure there's some. I've met some people who think, that climate change isn't, like, that anthropogenic climate change isn't a thing, and that sort of stuff. But in general, the people inside of these industries, the people at ExxonMobil, the people at Shell, the people at like this Basin Electric Power Plant that we're working at, right? Like, they're aware of this problem, and they want to contribute, and they don't want to ruin the planet for their kids and their grandkids, right? Like, humans in general, I believe in
Just like
humanity
Marble
in
did not
general.
want to cause cancer for the next generation. I mean, there's a lot of BS that you're discussing that goes on in your industry. I'm not saying you do it, but there are people who obviously know what's going on. They've done the studies, and climate change is real. My background's environmental chemistry. I've studied with lots of professors who were spending 20 years doing it. Unless they've wasted all their time, who the hell knows? They believe it's real. It's actually happening. To your point, it wasn't happening tomorrow. It's still going to play over decades, 10, 20, 30 years. But even 1 degree affects Florida. Okay. That's
Yeah,
it.
it does.
Oceans rise 1
Well,
degree. Miami floods.
I'll
It
give
doesn't
you-
have
I'll
to
give
be,
you-
hold on. It doesn't have to be these massive things like the whole world just destroyed. No, we just have less Miami. That's it.
I'll give you 2 points, and I'll leave. I was watching a video of this guy. He's a VC, and he was talking about a trip that he took to Antarctica, where there's like apparently a massive scientific base there, and they were showing them core samples that were drilled down that showed the Earth's temperature over 300,000 years, and scientists were showing them that at a specific point, say 200,000 years ago, the climate was 2 degrees or 3 degrees warmer than it is today. And that is exactly what they say that today would cause a doomsday scenario, right? And so the planet has naturally shifted. What their thesis is that the increased CO2 in the atmosphere, yes, humans are responsible for some of it, but that the temperature of the Earth naturally over years rises and falls, and that's what triggers the release of CO2, that it's not the other way around, that the CO2 isn't warming the atmosphere so much as the planet goes through cycles of heating and cooling, and that controls the levels of CO2. I also know that CO2 is required, or they use it in agriculture. They actually pump it into greenhouses because the plants consume CO2, and they create the oxygen that we breathe, and that actually has also helped agriculture be able to sustain the population that we have now. So then they're asking this guy, so then what do you think about like climate change and whatnot? And he goes, look, you know what I think? Speaking to Vitaly's point about Miami, he says, who are the people that if you want to build, like, if you look at Miami, they have all these like high-rise buildings, right there on the coast, right? Massive mega structures, massive hotels. He goes, the banks that write those loans to those companies, they do a tremendous amount of research in terms of risk. And he goes, if they're still okaying and green lighting and giving money on 40, 50-year leases to be able to build these massive structures there, he's like, there really is not a concern that we're going to have this coastal flooding like we think we're going to have. He goes, because if anybody knows how to assess risk 40, 50 years into the future, it's those banks that give the loans to build all these properties on our shorelines. And so I think somewhere in the middle of there is the actual solution, but I don't think it's a doomsday scenario. And I also don't think that it's something that we should take lightly.
Agreed. I could speak to a lot of those points, but like in general, I agree. Like, it's something that we need to be aware of. We need to be cognizant of. I think that anthropogenic climate change is a thing, right? Like, the science is, to me, very definitive. But at the same time, I like, we can adapt, and the risk, the immediate risk isn't something that we need to. It's not a reason to like base your whole life around that specific thing, right? Like, or to have existential dread and think that like the world's going to crap because we're burning all these fossil fuels. We are burning a lot of fossil fuels. We're doing it so that we can have the type of life that we live today, and we will find solutions so that in the future our kids don't have to deal with the same issues that we're dealing with now.
So in conclusion, Enphase, because that was the original conversation,
It's going to zero.
It's not going to zero, but the expectations for future growth may be a little bit more muted than what has been led to believe by a lot of people. Is that the conclusion that you're coming to the table with, KRIS?
In the short term, so Enphase is fine because it's like most of their stuff is residential, and it does make sense in some commercial and industrial aspects, right? And there's a ton of room for growth in that particular, like that vertical could go to a lot more, because residential only takes up like a third of the entire electricity of the system. So if you even had 80% penetration in residential, right, you'd then be getting to the point at which you start to kind of get to have instability in the grid and overall costs go up. So there's tons of headroom for SolarEdge, for Enphase to be winners, for other solar players to be winners, but be cognizant, I guess, of these other things that a lot of people don't talk about. Is that a decent way to look at it?
Makes sense. Makes sense.
I mean, you tried to lead him down a rabbit hole, KRIS, but basically he just bought Enphase. So I think he's showing he's bullish.
No, I'm not. No. All he's saying, and this is the same thing that even I'm trying to portray right now, is that there's not a scenario where this is unlimited TAM with zero competition. There's going to be competition in the space. The total addressable market is a lot more limited than people are expecting, right? So yes, I agree that solar is the future, but it's going to take a very long time to get there. Don't overpay for a company, that's growing at a certain pace, but also is facing headwinds in the future, and then also has a limited market to which it can operate in. And eventually, the thing with competition is that competition drives profits into the ground. So if enough competitors get into the market and Enphase can't differentiate itself as a technology that's superior X, Y, and Z, Y, then you're going to see over time the margins erode on Enphase, making it a less viable investment as a secular growth story. Okay. So when you look at certain industries, they are going to keep growing on top of each other and over and over and over. Solar will eventually hit a cap where the operating margins may end up negatively affecting their future growth prospects. And every incremental dollar in profit is going to be a hard fought battle for Enphase in the future.
So
where
KRIS,
we are in the life cycle of that.
Is that where you are?
So let me explain where we are in the life cycle of that. I have no clue. Maybe that's something that KRIS can.
Well, maybe KRIS can answer that. Where are we in the life cycle of solar adoption?
KRIS has to go.
I think we're near the beginning. Like
Okay.
there's still a lot of room to go, and as long as Enphase stays into duopoly, they're going to be a winner. Right,
You're a
like
genius.
the competition thing that KRIS highlights is something to be aware of, right? And that'll show up. I think, like, again, I try to be data driven, right? That'll show up in like margins, right? If you start seeing Enphase's margins start to tail out, then maybe I would worry, because like that's usually where you
Are you
start
sure
to see
about that?
competition show
I
up.
was saying margins should go down because in this high rate environment, which did affect them obviously and affected SolarEdge and everybody else for Sun Power and everybody, they should compress their margins. They should just make sure their
margins
product
will compress, but like if they go beyond what you'd expect from, say, so for example, in a high interest rate environment, like you expect margins to compress. But if we're at like if say next year we start to get a couple of rate cuts and you're still getting margin compression in that, then like maybe that is something where you're getting that because of competition, right? And so there are things that you can look at and at least try to project what are the reasons for this, right? And you're totally right. If it's a high, like, and Enphase has really high margins, and they'll be fine if margins compress a little. But if you can see consistent, just quarter over quarter over quarter, you get margin compression, that to me would be a signal that there is competition and that maybe they don't have the competitive advantage that they used to have.
Yeah,
what happens if it's like a Tesla play to just take market share to make sure they sell every single inverter that comes out of there?
I mean, in that case, then you have to address it at that level, right? Because I do think that that's a smart decision by Tesla, and it might be a smart decision by Enphase at that point if they were to do that. And so, like, there's not just a single number that you can look at and say, hey, look, margins compressed, you should sell this company, right? Like everything has to be taken with nuance and context of what's going on in the environment. And then,
but also, as long as they can continue to find ways of reducing costs, they can actually lower the prices on their devices to get more of them out there and still enjoy the same margins. This is partially what Tesla is doing with the gigacastings, and they're trying to lower the cost, still keep the margins the same while overall lowering the price and putting pressure on competitors. Yep. This is an advantage that Enphase should be able to enjoy because they are already at scale. And if they can do that, you're right. We should not see any compression in margins, more so than what is expected in a higher rate environment. But anything beyond that, then you say, yeah, maybe people are starting to eat their lunch. But at the same time, if the entire industry goes up, just like Tesla had 100% market share when there was no other EVs. Somebody else has one other EV, you don't have 100% anymore. So it's not also about market share. If the entire market is growing at a certain pace and Enphase can still compress some of their margins and lose some market share, but still at the end of the day be generating more money. And I think that's what it comes down to at the end of the line as an investment. How much money are you making? Right? How much money are you making? Right. Consistently making more and more money, quarter over quarter, year over year.
I just want to point out, I know Chris is talking about the margins and everything, but the TAM of Enphase itself, and I think you followed this, if you look at their deck, 2017, it was like $2,000, the maximum they can make at your house because all they sold was the inverters. 2021 or whatever, they said we can make 9,000 now because, well, we just introduced a battery. Now it's 2023. They're like, well, we could actually make 12,000 maximum in a person's house. So it grows because now they have chargers, they have the battery, they have this. So the point is that companies like this figure out ways to grow their markets, not shrink it, just like all of these tech firms, as they get larger. Who would have thought Tesla was going to make bots? And, FSD day one was not a discussion at Tesla. That's 10 years later. That's a discussion. Robo-taxis, like these things were not discussed when the company first hit and started becoming bigger.
Yeah, even with batteries, they didn't really start talking about things like energy.
Yeah,
arbitrage. I mean,
like
as long as you live in a place where you can buy and sell cheap, you have enough battery, you can start making some money. And if Enphase takes a small piece of that, I think at some point, if they figure out a way of having a subscription fee, I think if they could find some way of doing a monthly subscription for something, I'm not exactly sure what they could offer, but I think that's a money printer for them.
There's also another thing to consider also.
Chris, real quick, because Chris has a dinner he's got to get to. Yeah. So Chris, I don't know if you can stay another minute or we can call it here.
Yeah, I should probably get going.
You should probably go. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, man.
Part two.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, we should.
Thanks, everyone.
Sorry, I was late.
Later.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. Data-driven investing on Twitter is in the description. Check him out. We'll have him on again pretty soon. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Later.